to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 93, and my name is Janet Zabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. I have another interview episode this week, and it got a little bit long. It seems when I interview people that we always get to chatting and there's a lot to talk about. I hope that doesn't keep you from listening. Break it up into a couple of sessions if that helps you out. Maybe save it for a road trip or play it in the background while you're sewing so that you have something to listen to. I'll give you just a quick sewing update. I did get a breather in the schedule last week and I got quite a bit done. I finished the flat lock crazy quilt pillow that I was working on, and that is now at the store as a display sample. I whipped out a Calland tote. I think that's how you pronounce it. It's K-A-L-A-N-D, Calland Weekender Tote by Sotac Handmade, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. I have a travel tote that I think I bought from Land's End or LL Bean, one of those two places, about 30 years ago, and it's starting to show some wear, and I think I'm going to have to recreate it. I haven't been able to find anything to purchase that is even remotely like it, and I love it. So I'm busy testing out lots of different tote bag designs to see what comes closest to that design and how I can modify it. And so far, the Calland tote has gotten the closest. I made that out of some canvas from the local quilt store with a waxed canvas base. It came together very quickly. It was a joy to sew. The pattern was well done. I liked everything about it, and that also went to the store as a display sample. I know that when I'm shopping, sometimes it helps to have sample items available to look at because I might not know what to do with a particular kind of fabric. So I'm making these things, and I certainly don't need yet another tote. I've made lots of tote bags, so we're putting them on display at the store. I have almost finished my By Annie A Place for Everything tote, another tote. This one's going to hold some supplies, though, for when I go to workshops. That was another fun sew. Her patterns are just fabulous with very detailed step-by-step instructions. And hopefully this weekend I'll get to put that one together. I pinned the zipper gusset to the front this morning, and I just have to sew and bind those two seams and add the page straps, and I'll be done with it. I've also been testing out an Amanda Murphy pattern. It's a table runner because I thought perhaps it might make a good class. The jury is still out on that one. I do want to finish it because I love the design, but I'm just not sure that it's going to make a good class. You can tell that I got a little tired of making clothing and garments, so I've been doing something a little bit different for the last week, and I'll probably keep working on some bag patterns for another week or two yet. Just a reminder that the 100th episode is coming up in a few weeks. I've gotten lots of good listener questions. I appreciate all the wonderful notes and feedback that I've been getting, so please keep those coming. And you can email me at janet@janetzabo.com. So without further ado, let's jump into this week's episode. My guest is a return guest. I had JoJo Beazel on the podcast back in May of 2024 on episode 34, and I will link to that if that's one that you haven't listened to or if you'd like to go back and listen to it again. JoJo is the owner of Seams Perfect Industrial Sewing Machines in Fresno, California, and I always enjoy talking to JoJo, so we're going to have another conversation. We could talk about sewing machines for hours, but I kept it to just about under an hour for this conversation, and I hope that you will learn some additional useful information about industrial sewing machines. So I am here with JoJo Beazel, And after my last episode on industrial machines, JoJo very kindly offered to come back on the show and do a deep dive into a few more topics having to do with industrial sewing machines. So, welcome back.
Hi, it's great to be here.
And you are the owner of Seems Perfect Industrial Sewing Machines. And you're in Fresno, California. Do I have that correct?
Yes, I'm located in Fresno, California. Have a little studio downtown at the moment.
You and I have been visiting about sewing machines, and we visited for quite a while actually, because two sewing machine aficionados getting together have a lot to talk about.
Oh, yes, connoisseurs even.
Yes, absolutely. The episode that I did, as I said, was kind of a quick and dirty overview. And as we were talking, I mentioned that maybe 20 years ago, there just weren't as many home sewists using industrial sewing machines. That seems to have exploded with bag making. A lot more people are into making bags now, into home deck, into upholstery, that kind of thing. And also, along with that, more people are interested in vintage sewing machines. And so that's kind of a special intersection there, and one where you have a lot of expertise. So I think we'll start out by talking about, you could give us your history with vintage sewing machines and industrial sewing machines. It's very similar to mine, where we maybe started out by not getting the right machine because we didn't understand exactly what we were looking for. So if you want to talk a little bit about that, we'll start there.
Yeah, the impetus for my, initial foray into sewing machines, again as an adult, was I had the desire to do upholstery work. I had a woodworking business at the time, and I wanted to be able to make upholstery pieces. So I was loosely, on the hunt for uh, some kind of upholstery machine, not really having any clue what that is, just having heard the vague term industrial, and like a lot of people, I had the mild misconception of, any old black singer from the 20s or 40s or 50s is good enough, it's heavy duty or what have you. And that ought to be able to sew through whatever. That misses the point in a number of ways that we can discuss. I started out with the vintage sewing machines just out of, like a practical sense. I tend to be a very thrifty person. And so I found an old Viking, and bought it for $40, and it didn't quite work. And I was mechanically minded, having been in several mechanical related trades like automotive, etc. And I just kind of dug into the thing, and I was like, oh, fascinating, And as I'd mentioned in my previous podcast, my earliest experiences with sewing machines was when I was a kid and I wanted to learn how things worked. And a sew and vac guy in town, with one of those repair shops, uh, my dad talked him into letting me take machines and take them apart. Well, I figured out the vacuums real fast, and I ended up working on a lot of other appliances and eventually cars. But the sewing machines, they baffled me. They were fascinating, but they were so complicated in comparison, and not entirely intuitive. So, so that was a mystery that remained unsolved for a long time. Fast forward to 2020 during the pandemic. I'm trying to survive and to adapt and whatnot. Uh, a lot of people had taken up woodworking. So I got real serious about trying to find the sewing machine, and I just kind of missed doing it. And so I got that Viking and I fixed it, and I was like, well, look at me, I fixed that. Well, that's crazy. Now I can fix a sewing machine. As I'd always said, I can fix anything but a sewing machine. And now I could. And then I found a Singer 201 when I was going to look for a piece of furniture for my kids' room or whatever. And this guy had a Singer 201 sitting in a bucket of shoes outside. Uh, and it was just so derelict. And I was just like, that poor little thing, how much do you want for it? And the guy was convinced to sell it for $20, and it was all frozen up. And I still have that machine today because it's very special to me. But I learned from that machine, that I loved vintage sewing machines, and it quickly became this thing, this obsessive hobby where I would get a vintage sewing machine and I would just like restore it to, this kind of showroom condition, or I found myself enjoying a challenge like a machine that, was found outside on the ground, or, at the dump or whatever. People started to take note, because I was like, oh, there's the sewing machine person. Um, I even had like guys who worked, who did garbage pickup that knew that they could call me and get a quick buck, if they found something good. And so that was a big part of it. But in the meantime, I still wanted to sew upholstery. And, I kind of did some internet research and some general kind of tinkering myself, and realized a number of reasons why uh, a domestic sewing machine, an old black Singer or a 1950s, Elna or Foth or whatever, the home machines, especially anything new, they just weren't up to the task. But contrary to a lot of people's perceptions, the thing that makes them not particularly good for upholstery and leatherworking was less to do with how strong it was and more to do with how it moves the material, and a lot of the things, in terms of like the thread management and whatnot. I kept having these people, I'd sell a machine, you know uh I'd put like a Singer 1591 up, and people would be like, does it sew leather? And I was like, kinda, no, yes, let me get back to you on that. And I ended up finding, digging in really deep and figuring out not only if it sews leather, but why it necessarily doesn't do a particularly good job of that or whatever. And that led me to the industrial machines with a walking foot, which is like the kind of standard design of upholstery and leatherworking machines.
I mentioned this, I think, in the podcast episode that I did on industrial machines, that I ran across a 201 that somebody had been using for leather work, and they literally wore out the linkages.
Yeah, yeah, they get, that's really hard on the components for a machine like that. They're not really built for that level of force, repeatedly. There's what a machine can do and what it can do often, or constantly. And that's like the big difference between an industrial and a standard, domestic sewing machine, what have you. And that's even the difference between an industrial of one type and of another, because, some machines are just designed to sew silk, 24/7. And they can do that expertly without without taking breaks or anything, just 24 hours, sweatshop kind of thing. But those machines are terrible for leather, you know, and a leather sewing machine typically can't sew anything even remotely like silk.
So two things when people are considering an industrial sewing machine is what are you going to sew with it? And also, they're designed to, as you say, work 24/7.
Yeah. Or they're designed to at least work at, on a professional level because I mean, in general, leather workers don't just drive, the machine for 8 hours a day. They do little bits here and there, by the nature of it. So those machines also typically will have manual oiling systems and things like that. They don't need to be able to run 2,000 stitches per minute or any of that. As a matter of fact, it's generally preferable that they run it, a stitch a second or so.
So when somebody comes to you and says, I'm interested in an industrial machine, what kinds of questions do you ask them?
I've actually found that I tend to act as the interpreter you know, of use when someone comes and they have like a unique use case and they're like, hey, I want to be able to sew bags, well, bags made out of what? And, to what extent do you want to sew bags? Is that like going to be your whole thing now? Because being able to sew one or two bags out of canvas, you can do that on a wider variety of machines than you can make, you know, coach style purses, really boutique, nice purses and wallets and such. To the same token, if you're going to sew exclusively on lighter canvas, you don't necessarily need as heavy a machine for that. But it's not just a question of how heavy the machine is. It's also just a question of like predominantly what kinds of materials and how many layers of them are you going to need? Do you bind? Uh, a lot of professionals, if they bind, they have a dedicated binding machine. But, ideally, you at least want your one machine to be able to do a variety of operations.
Let's say I'm a beginning bag maker. What might you start me out with if I say, hey, I want to sew waxed canvas?
That would be like a heavier drop feed machine or something like that. Drop feed meaning that it only drives the material from the bottom with the feed dog. Or you could get a dual or triple feed walking foot system. And what a walking foot is the name kind of uh, belies the use of it. It looks like it's just walking along, pit, 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 pit. My partner calls them doot doots. And she's like, oh, that machine has the doot doots. I'll buy that. She knows that that's a shoe in for a machine that's generally desirable because it has that versatility of being able to walk over larger seams and process a variety of materials and in any number of layers, and transitions between more layers and fewer.
I sometimes wonder um, if you're sewing on a domestic machine and you start breaking needles, or you have to turn the hand wheel by hand to get it over seams. That
Yeah.
seems to me that that's a signal that your machine is not up to the task.
Yeah, if, there are mild exceptions, but in general, if the machine struggles to do the work, then it's probably not up to the task. You'll find with a machine that doesn't have a walking foot, if you're sewing something sticky like vinyl, for instance, it has a lot of friction, it will it will drag on the throat plate in such a way that shortens the stitch. It can't pull it consistently the same stitch length, which can also cause birds' nests, thread jams and stuff like that. But of course, it makes everything look like crap, and often will cause, like, if you have multiple layers of material, they'll shift relative to each other, and you'll get puckers and all that sort of thing. What the dual feed walking foot does is it has a top and bottom feeding system. The actual foot moves with the feed dog in in combination, or in sync with the feed dog, and that pulls the material through in between stitches. On the triple feed, that's actually, it's one better. So what it does is it also moves the needle bar, and the needle bar will the needle will pierce the material, and then the whole combination of it will drag through, and it effectively pins the material as it goes, which is really nice and really versatile in some situations.
Would you give my listeners your toothpick, your sandwich analogy? I think it's so descriptive.
Yeah, so I made a post a while back on my Instagram where I likened the combination of materials. If you have a layer for bag making or for upholstery, and it's like a lining and uh, some kind of stiffener and a shell and all that. It's kind of like a sandwich, like a club sandwich or something, where they put the toothpick in, and it keeps the insides from slipping out. And when the needle goes through the material, it kind of just acts like that toothpick. It just holds the material, all of the all of the layers, in line with each other, and then pulls it through. And just like when you bite into a sandwich and there's a fancy sandwich with lots of layers, and the toothpick holds the food, the ingredients all in the sandwich, rather than spitting them out one side or the other. That's what that does. And it's very good at it. On a walking foot machine, you can have quite a bit of resistance from friction or heavy materials, or bad technique to some degree, um, and it will generally stitch true with anything that doesn't have at least two forms of feeding, and ideally three. Then you're going to have that kind of scoot around, or worse, just won't go.
We've talked a little bit about the feeding mechanism. You also mentioned thread handling. The industrial machines are different in the way they handle the thread.
Yeah, well, for one, all the holes for the thread, the guides that the thread passes through, are larger to accommodate thicker threads. Um, they uh, they have heavier tension capability through the various tensioning apparatuses, stiffer take-up springs so that it pulls the stitch tighter. You think, like, when you're hand sewing, you have this feel for, like, okay, I need to suck up the stitch and get it, the right tension. Well, on a home machine, it'd be it would not be able to pull the stitch tight enough to suck the material together, and then you have this very weak stitch, which is a big limitation. I've sewn a few ounces of leather in a couple layers on a Singer 15 before, just for funsies, to see if it worked. and it did, but the resulting stitch didn't pull the material in at all, and it looked like crap. It was really easy to snap it, and it loosens over time, so on. So those higher thread tensions are pretty important. You need to have higher bobbin tension as well, because everything needs to be drawn, tight enough without a lot of assistance. If you need to dial up the tension all the way or 80% of the way, then your machine maybe isn't pulling the thread tight enough, isn't capable of it. And then you also have things like the throat clearance and the hook clearance and the foot clearance and all this stuff. Thread takes up space. When you're using a heavier thread, such as you would for bag making or upholstery or leatherworking, those threads have to pass through a larger part in the throat plate to complete the stitch, and there's more obstructions. A lot of times it's real tight in there, and it is so by design so that everything stays in place.
I think there are a couple of Juki models that have a thick throat plate that you can get as an accessory for when you're using those heavier threads.
Yeah. And another thing that they do have those, and I know like some of the clothing, garment uh, grade machines, such as the DDL 8700, popular model for garment construction and so on. You can get a supposed heavy parts upgrade for it, or you can buy the one with that ends in H. And what that effectively has is a different throat plate, more aggressive feed dog, and um, uh, a heavier tension spring and take a spring. But, now you're working at the limits of that machine more often than not. You want to keep within the designed limits of the machine fairly well, just so that it can consistently do what it does, rather than go wear prematurely or give you bad stitches or tend to break things. The needle range can be, pretty significant. You could go from 18 to 24 on like a walking foot machine, but you can't do that without moving the hook saddle and retiming the machine. It's not necessarily for the faint of heart, and it's not practical to do regularly. So you're not going to be sewing curtains on your bag making machine, and you're not going to be bag making on your brother home machine or whatever you have.
Can we talk a little bit about motors?
Yes. An industrial sewing machine, by definition, has an external motor. Yeah. Typically, in the configuration that they're in, they are on some form of a standalone table with the motor attached to the table, and then it's connected with a belt. And a lot of people, when they buy a machine, an old industrial that they just get uh, as found as made from the factory, they'll come with a clutch motor, which similar to a clutch in a car or something. You have to kind of learn how to feather it to control it. But it's a lot touchier than a car. you know it's a very acquired skill. The people who have done it uh, for their entire career have incredible control with a clutch motor, provided that it's adjusted well and so on. But most people, the first time they encounter a clutch motor, it could even turn them off of sewing with that machine, because they go 0 to you know on fire and like uh, in an instant. You know, a lot of those motors run at 100 RPM,
I'm
and
I'm laughing
it can
because
all one.
my
Yeah, that's
Juki
scary.
Thurger has a clutch motor on it. And it's
Yeah,
actually not too bad, but then, I've driven a stick shift for most of my adult life, so I'm used to
yeah,
that. And going to my Juki 1541, which has a servo motor. So maybe
exactly.
talk a little bit about servo motors and what the advantages are.
Yeah, so servo motors, for one, you can program them typically. There's dumb ones and then there's fancy digital ones. Either way, they tend to have adjustable, high speed, and you can set them at a lower speed, and then they can't take off on you. Like if you put the pedal all the way down, they'll go 200 stitches per minute or something very manageable. Keeping in mind that a home sewing machine at best is about 1,000 stitches per minute. So, two 200 stitches per minute is pretty manageable even with some pretty technical sewing. And it's nice to have that control. It essentially turns an industrial from being kind of a specialty item that requires, that has this sharp learning curve, to now it behaves a lot more like a home sewing machine where it doesn't make any sound when it's not being used. And then when you put the pedal on, it just kind of, you know, there's this wide range of speed that you can control very naturally. It's a lot more pleasant in that sense.
I have
And
my
with a
Juki 1541 set at 200 stitches per minute. And
yeah,
and
I mean, most people want it around there.
that's not
I
necessarily because I can't control it. It's because a lot of times when I'm making bags or something like that, I want to be able to stitch slowly so that the top stitching looks good. And if I have to pivot,
absolutely.
yeah,
Well, and if you're stitching with leather, you get one chance. If you put a bunch of unnecessary holes in, then you ruined your piece.
good point.
Hide hides like that, or hide like materials like vinyl or rubber. Once you pierce them, there's a hole there. It doesn't bounce back.
So do you find that some of your clients end up having more than one machine?
Some of my clients are as bad as me. They'll have uh 10, 15 machines. A more sane and typical number, for someone who's like a working professional, depending on the profession, would be like two or three. You know, uh, Two gives you quite a range. If you have a standard kind of walking foot upholstery grade machine, then that can do most of your heavy stuff, if not all. And then, your standard home sewing machine can do the rest. If you do a lot, you might have an industrial zigzag as well, because it's also worth noting these are specialty items. The machines aren't typically zigzag. And as a matter of fact, it's fairly uncommon for a walking foot to be a zigzag. I don't come across them very often. There's only a couple models that exist. Um, and the reason for that is because the mechanism, in order to walk and, all that, it needs to have a very rigid and precise needle bar frame that can pivot, and it would be too weak the other way. Um, and then also, uh, people get heavier stuff or different stuff. Shoemakers use maybe 7 to 12 machines, if they make shoes from scratch or whatever. Because there's ones for the soles and there's ones for the uppers and there's ones for patching and all these different things. It's really just best to buy as you like discover new needs. You know, a lot of people will advise that if you want to do bag making, for instance, that you start out with a flatbed. You can sew flat a lot of stuff and get your toes wet. And as you get used to that, then you can reward yourself with a cylinder arm or a post bed. Those machines have more versatility in terms of being able to sew three-dimensional objects, but there are ways to sew things flat and then just seam them together. You know, you also have generally it costs a lot less for a flatbed than either of the other two.
Can we talk a little bit about vintage versus modern?
Yeah. So I tend to favor vintage to a point. The old stuff is just made with, that they had better steel back then. Um, they're not so cost engineered. Some of that stuff is just incredibly well built. Most industrial sewing machines I come across, once I'm done with them, once I've restored them or reconditioned them, they'll last to my kids' grandchildren or something. They're very robust. I have machines from 1912, 1916, things like that are industrials. And I mean, home machines back to 1870 or so. And, every single one of them is robust and, in a way that new things aren't. But especially in the last 20 years or so, there has been a push toward making even industrials pretty cheap, so I don't feel like the newest ones, like your kind of typical Chinese mail order ones, even if they're a copy of a well received design. There's all these copies of like common Chukis and Adlers and Fofs and things like that. And the copies, I've compared them side to side. The castings are cheaper and more brittle. The machining is sloppier. The steel is weaker, that kind of thing. They're not lasting items. And they also incorporate plastic, for the first time ever. Because industrial sewing machines typically, way past the time that domestic machines stopped having all steel internals, you know, industrial machines typically will have like no plastic in them, and even some of the best brands like Foff have started incorporating some plastic components that just kind of cheapen the feel of the machine. You know, those parts aren't the most crucial, but when you're talking about a machine that's 50 years old, I just don't think that the current uh, manufacturing FOFs that are assembled in China are going to be like these ones where I find them in old shops and I'm able to store them to like new condition and everything works within spec and exquisitely at that.
Do you have trouble finding parts for vintage machines? I had to have a part machined for one of my vintage machines because there was no way I was going to find a replacement for it.
You know, yes and no. So the funny thing, or the wonderful thing about industrial specifically, because they are used in industry and they tend to, you know, have this emphasis on longevity um, and whatnot, and also because they're kind of simplified in some ways. They tend to share a lot more parts than any domestic generally will. They tend to be a little more modular. There are cases where they use the same bobbin case on like 10 different manufacturers or something, which is really convenient when you're in a production environment and you're just like, crap, need a different bobbin case or whatever, I need another throat plate. That's not always the case, but what I'm saying is the parts are generally more common and they're available a lot longer, it would seem, than the old stuff. I had a lot harder time finding stuff for vintage home machines. The industrial stuff, I can find parts for relatively easy, with the exception of more obscure and esoteric designs. But as far as like all of the common designs that you'd find in a cylinder arm or a post bed or a flatbed walking foot machine, they're all actually kind of based on the same pattern. They utilize the design features and even like the direct castings in some cases that of the Singer 111 uh, triple feed walking foot machine, your grandpa's upholstery machine, and the main differences between that and the current model Juki are, the new Juki has a little bit more intuitive stitch adjustment, and they've added sometimes some electronics wizardry, for automatic backstitch and automatic thread cutting and stuff like that. Of course, they have reversed. The original 111 did.
Can you maybe explain the difference between a cylinder arm and a post bed machine? Because
Yeah.
those aren't quite as common as the other types of machines, and maybe people aren't as familiar with them.
Yeah, going back to how I generally have to interpret people's needs and whatnot, a lot of times people, they might know about a cylinder arm machine, which a cylinder arm is essentially like your home machine when you remove the free arm engine, except that the cylinder, is smaller and completely round so that it can sew in the round, or you can sew the gussets of handbags and that sort of thing. You can sew cylinders with ease, and there's a lot of application for that. With a post, they take that whole concept, but put it all on like a post. There's, like a 7-inch square post, and and then the needles up at the top of that. And so when you sew on a post bed, you can sew like inside boxes and stuff like that, and in any direction, because the post is kind of freestanding, you know. And say you were sewing a square bag of some kind, or a backpack or something, you can just kind of sew through the corner and then rotate and then sew, another direction. And they're extremely versatile. And I actually tend to favor a post bed for like your general purpose bag making and, create three-dimensional sewing. They're a little more open-ended. With the cylinder arm, you're limited to forward, backward on the on the ground or whatever. But with a post bed, you can go up and down and sideways and all these things. They have their limitations, but I'd say they're one of the most versatile kind. And it seems like a lot of people are picking up on that now. I've had nice conversations with a few people in the industry about, how cool it is that a post bed, it doesn't really have the limitations of cylinder arm. And the cylinder arms have kind of an inflated price because everyone seems to want a cylinder arm. You know, I get it, but if I had one machine and I wanted to be able to do a lot with it, like a walking foot post bed machine would be the one, or a roller foot one. They have powered roller foot ones, which is like the best of all worlds. When you have that roller foot, you can just go in any direction with this sweeping, just like fluid kind of control, and twisting in and out. You can make really good circles. That's why those are used for making shoes, so that you can just kind of go in whatever direction you need.
You suggested that I watch a video on YouTube, which I did last night, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes about paratroopers in the 40s who had to
Yeah,
repair their own parachutes. And the
yeah,
the fascinating thing about that video was the different kinds of sewing machines. So bar tackers and ones that made buttonholes and cylinder arm. There,
yeah.
the
They,
variety of industrial machines out there is mind-boggling sometimes.
oh yeah, people don't realize, like, because a lot of times industrial is shorthand for like the machine that can make uh car seats or whatever, and like the vast majority of industrials aren't that thing. There are thousands of types of industrials. There's ones for setting a pocket on the pants, the seat of jeans or whatever, and it does it all automatic. It sets the pocket, sews it, and then moves to the next one. There's ones that attach buttons, and they're all like on this little carousel, and the machine takes a robotic arm and goes and just throws the buttons down, and it stitches them lightning fast. Um, yeah, so there's a really wide variety of industrial sewing machines. I deal with a lot of specialty machines, and I very much enjoy it. Every machine in that video, actually, I've had some form of. Uh, a popular one is the darning machine, which looks like a cylinder arm, but it doesn't have any sort of feed. It's designed so that you can use the mending operation darning, and just fill in the the hole with thread, going back and forth and rotating around the arm, crosshatched and whatnot. And that's how they repair parachutes. That's how you can repair denim and all this stuff. Those are some of the most sought after machines that I ever acquire, because the denim industry is obsessed with them. There's this boutique selvage denim industry that uh, has a lot of really, enthusiasts. I have a waiting list for them, similar to the chain stitch embroidery machines that do that kind of loopy uh, monogramming script type thing,
The
like you see on old
Cornleys.
Western wear. Yeah, like Cornelius and the Singer 114W 103. I restore those from the ground up. They're a very complex machine, and there's a lot of moving parts in them. I I would have to say there's probably at least 100 moving parts, and a lot of things happen at once each stitch. So so they require a lot of finesse, and they have very specialized parts. That's a machine that's hard to get parts for. The people who have them, they hold the parts.
Hmm.
Um, which I don't blame them, because even the modern replica parts do not fit the machines, in practice. They are just not precise enough. And that's another thing about these vintage machines is the tolerances that they machined everything to were obscene. Like, how they got that kind of precision from manual machine processes. I I stand in awe of that.
It truly is an art.
Really, it is, and they look artful. Every part of those machines have to be so perfectly faced and aligned and polished and everything because you'll have parts that move past each other quickly, uh, maybe a few hundred times a minute, and they they are interference parts. They'll pass in the same space, and if any of them has 16th of an inch too much material, that will strike and grind and just really gum up the works.
Is there anything else you want to talk about? We're getting close to the end of our time, so
Yeah, as far as machines for kind of artisanal work, getting into your leather working, and a lot of people want to make belts and holsters and be able to sew patches on hats and so on. You know, it's important to identify what kinds of machines will satisfy that need, because some of them are very specialized and uh, very adapted to specific situations. A common example of that is the patching machine or cobbler's machine. That's the one that has the big arm on the top that looks like a bridge. It's like got a truss pattern to it, and they look very old timey, which makes sense. It's a design that's like 150 years old, and the head rotates 360 degrees and whatnot. But the bobbin on those is designed for like a few feet of a run. They're literally fratching. And so if you wanted to go and make a bag on that, well, that's just not practical, you know. Um, but they're really, really good at repairing the things in tight, confined spaces and whatnot, like the toe of a shoe or a boot even, you know. So that's a really cool option. But if you wanted to do a lot of kind of general purpose cover making and cases and bags and backpacks and so on, you can do a lot with even a flatbed or like a post bed. And there's a lady who I'm going to shout out, Barbara Craig of Recent Relics. I don't know if you know her. She's developed these attachment tables. I'm really excited about this because there already exist these sort of solutions for putting like a flatbed onto a cylinder arm or whatever. But she took it to a whole nother level, and they're made out of aluminum and really well machined, really precise. They weigh nothing, and they take a few seconds to put on, as opposed to the more typical like 10 minutes plus. You know, they're gorgeous, and I've been talking to her about us making a few more designs for some specialized machines. She's been doing one for post beds, and when you have that, like, now you have the best of all worlds, really, because you can just throw that thing on, you know, and do all your like flat work like you would with a flatbed machine. It's not quite as ergonomic because you have to kind of stand to do it, but if you had one machine, something like that, or a cylinder arm with one of those tables, is a very versatile combination. especially, you're worried about space and things like that.
That's cool. I will get the information from you and we'll put that in the show notes. It sounds to me, I think in wrapping this up, that if you're interested in an industrial machine, it helps to go to somebody like you because as you say, you interpret, how did you put that? You interpret the use?
Yeah, just like people people often want to make a thing, but they don't exactly know how it was processed,
Exactly.
you know. And so these machines can be highly specific and they can be configured in ways that are more specialized for all kinds of things.
How can people get a hold of you? Do you have a website?
I have like a domain that, no, I don't have a website.
That's okay.
But I am on social media. I have a Instagram and a Facebook page. Both of those are at Seems Perfect SEW. That's Seems SEAM.
Uh-huh.
Seems Perfect. Yeah. And I do some interesting posting on my social. I kind of try to stay plugged in. And so, I just started this thing called Weird Machine Wednesday, you know, not my idea, but, definitely a good idea. Um, and it's fun because I can then, point out a machine that people probably haven't ever seen before. I can post some information about it, some pictures, or maybe even a video. And I kind of want to evolve that, because I come across machines that do crazy things, all the time. Ones that
Sure.
sew books, you know what I mean?
Right.
So, so that's really fun. I like spreading the knowledge and information.
You
I,
post on the Vintage Industrial Sewing Machine group on Facebook too.
yeah, I have posted on there a lot, tried to offer information when I had answers for something, and being as obsessed about sewing and sewing machines as I am, I've grown to understand a lot. So it's fun to, be nerdy about it. Um, but I'm gonna be at the bag and sew
The
expo.
the Sack Bag and Sew Expo in September.
Yeah,
Yeah. Talk a
yeah, I'm
little
gonna
bit
be
about
there in
that.
September. I will let you fill them in on the date because I can't remember. I think it's the 12th.
I'll have to look it up, but I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, please. Um, yeah, it was organized online in some of the industrial sewing groups, and there's going to be, all these vendors and classes um, on how to sew various things. I know there's going to be someone there talking about how to sew shoes, and there's going to be several bag makers and pattern makers. And, uh, I'm going to be doing live demonstrations of various industrial machines. I hope to have a cylinder arm flatbed and post bed machine so I can show them, the their differences and what they specialize in. So I'll be doing that. Come say hi. Uh, Ask me any question you want about sewing machines, and it'll be open to the public, but the classes, I think most of them are already full. Uh, this is like a year uh, in planning, and so we're all very excited about it. It's the first one, but California has needed something like this, and so or the West Coast even. So we're gonna have a great time. A lot of a lot of people coming to this event.
Yeah, that's great. And you are providing the grand prize, I understand.
Yeah, I am an industrial sewing machine, no less. There's a lot of buzz about that. It's very exciting. This particular sewing machine is one that's near and dear to my heart, the 620U, which is a zigzag slash straight stitch kind of uh, master of all, or just very, very versatile general purpose kind of machine. I know a lot of actual techs who sew, who it's like their core machine or whatever, because you can do kind of anything with it, and it has some pretty cool party tricks too.
Well, I have really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope that my listeners have learned a little bit more about industrial sewing machines. There's a lot to know.
Yeah, there is, but it's not anything that you can't learn. You know, don't be intimidated by them. Uh, let them inspire you.
I appreciate JoJo coming back to talk to me. We always have a lot to talk about. And if you're anywhere near the SAC Bag and Sew Expo, which is going to be in Sacramento, California, September 12th to the 14th, stop by and say hi to JoJo. And I hope that this is the first of many, 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 many more SAC Bag and Sew Expos. Feedback. I love feedback. Email me at janet@janetzabo.com. Leave a comment on the show notes page. Use the fan mail feature. There are lots of ways to get in touch with me. I appreciate everyone who's leaving ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts. The podcast has really taken off this summer, and I have all of my great listeners to thank for that. So thank you so much. Until next time, I hope you have a great week and that you get to go sew something.